for those of you who don't know, we are JPR Environmental, and we are an ecological contractor. About half of what we do is protected species mitigation, and the other half is general landscaping, usually where there's some sort of wetland involved. So the most recent thing that large-scale wetland project we've done has been lake reprofiling at Boddenham Lake in Herefordshire, which was an interesting project. We've sponsored or supported CIEEM for the last few years, so we get the opportunity to do these breakout sessions. This is the last one. First one was on the carbon neutral plans for Stroud District Council. Yesterday we had a really interesting discussion about Great Crested Newt mitigation and district level licensing. Hi Andy, and hi, good to see you. And today, biodiversity net gain. So the aim was for this to be a discussion. I'm certainly no expert on biodiversity net gain myself, but more of a discussion of what it might mean for developers, for ecologists, and for, if we get time, for contractors like us. So in a way, it's a bit of a more formalised version of what might happen around our stand if we were physically at the conference. So just to say, just maybe keep your mic off if you're not speaking, but obviously very welcome for you to have your cameras on if you want to, and if you want to, interruptions very welcome. Just raise your hand. You should, if you raise your hand virtually, you should appear on the top of my screen, and then I can bring you in at that point. Actually, it'd be interesting to know, I just had a quick chat with Gregory while we were waiting for the event to start, but who's been involved in any biodiversity net gain projects? So so Andy, Rob, maybe in the chat if not.
Yeah, Richard as well, I saw there, Liz.
Richard as well, brilliant, okay. So, you know, as I said, I'm not going to probably tell you anything that you don't know about biodiversity net gain. It really is a discussion about what it might mean. So I'll just do, I've got a few slides that will just help lead the discussion, but don't worry, it won't be death by PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen, and I will have half an eye on letting others in as well. So obviously, just a very brief, what is biodiversity net gain? It's going to be formally introduced into the planning system via the Environment Bill. I was slightly surprised to hear that that's not going to be until 2023. I thought that would be slightly earlier than that, but there you go. And specifically, as you all know, developers have to provide a 10% net gain in biodiversity for any new development that results in habitat loss or degradation. So far, I'm sure that's all, none of that is news to you. Okay. So, and as somebody said this morning, the bill itself is in the report stage and it's just due for its third reading. So I thought the target was to start, the targets would start in 2022, but it sounds like it won't be mandatory law until 2023. So developers are going to have to submit a biodiversity net gain plan to the local planning authority for the planning authority's approval, and that habitat has got to be maintained for 30 years. And the net gain element will be calculated using the government's biodiversity metric, which somebody else was talking about this morning, and that's currently on version 2.0 and is going to go to version 2.3. So just from that, if I could maybe throw it open, there's a few questions about what that might mean for developers. And talking to ecologists and reading online, possibly developers are going to need to appoint their ecologists early on to get their plans in place. You could argue, well, they'd have to do that anyway if they're protected species on site, but I would imagine the earlier the ecologist gets involved, the better for developers. Also, another ecologist has said, well, he's found in the past that actually the landscape architect often fulfills that function and not the ecologist. So I don't know what people feel about whether that function of producing a biodiversity net gain plan might actually not be fulfilled by an ecologist but somebody else. And also in some cases, would the development need to be scaled down? That metric is going to penalise offset, which is away from the development site, and obviously score more highly offset, which is either on site or very close to site. So maybe some developments possibly would need to be scaled down. Some of them maybe would not be viable at all. So I'd quite like to throw that open now and see if anybody's got anything to say about that. And if nobody puts their hand up, I'm going to pick on somebody. So probably Rob. I don't know, Andy, if you've got... Sorry?
Yeah, so, well, you're right. We're all going to say that ecologists have to be appointed early on. My experience so far is that that's improving, actually. I have had a project now where they're realising that, particularly with small sites, that they need to get an ecologist on board. But it's not always the case. And I actually have had one project which was built a few years ago where they're wanting to retrospectively do biodiversity net gain. I'm not entirely sure why, actually. The other thing is that I think about landscape architects, I think they could well fulfil that role. But there is a thing in the guidance that says it's not a substitute for ecological expertise. So ecologists should be in there, but I think there is possibly a risk, if you want to see it that way, that landscape architects could sort of take over. And that's not an anti-landscape architect thing.
No.
But, previously with BREEAM, architects were quite good at sort of doing that rather than ecologists.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting also, this idea of getting people involved early on, because the amount of times we're rung up by we're talking about the other end of development now and saying, can you put in 1,000 metres of newt fencing next week, because we've suddenly realised that we've got to fulfil this. And it's amazing how often that seems to take developers by surprise. But I don't know if other people, either Richard Marsh or Andy Duncan, have got anything to add on their experience. Andy?
I think I'll start with the second thing. I think other professions are certainly able to do some of the basic optioneering, and I think that is the key: is to get early knowledge of whether the project has got trouble ahead. And you don't need to be a full-on ecologist to do some of those optioneering, just to put some numbers into the metric. You will fairly easily get an answer of whether you've got to work harder or whether it's an easy win to get your 10% net gain. So I think that is the key, to get someone involved early on.
Yeah.
And even landscape architects, they can have a clue about what a baseline habitat is, even if you haven't done your phase 1 surveys and things in advance.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Andy. Richard, did you want to add anything there from your experience?
Yeah, just check you can hear me okay.
You're good, yeah.
I suppose I'm looking at it from a local authority perspective. So I see the reports coming in from consultants, and it is interesting times really. And I think I try and put the 10% net gain to one side for now and just think we want the metric to be used. I mean, that's the important first step in educating everybody, I think, from my point of view within a local authority. Is getting the planning officers used to this new thing called a metric, and also the local councillors who get given the reports from the planning officers. So yeah, I'm very glad that in Leeds City Council, where I work, for the last 6 months we've been seeing reports coming in using the metric. Whether we can push them to go for 10% or not is, I try and put that to one side for now and saying we're aspiring for 10%, but I know we can't dig our feet in and say we haven't got policy backing, or the environment bill hasn't been enacted yet. So the important thing is it's still a challenge to get back to neutral, I'm finding, with the metric. Yeah. And that makes the real point. And I suppose connected to this conference, the big thing I'm finding is there's a big desire from colleagues of mine within forward planning to try and deliver green space on site wherever possible. So the big message we're trying to put out there is, yes, we want you to deliver biodiversity and maybe net gain, and we want you to do it on site, which may mean sometimes the red line boundaries that are coming in are slightly bigger. But we think it is important people have contact with wildlife and try and do it near where they live.
Yeah.
And the most useful tool I've found, which I kind of want more people to talk about really, is the Natural England accessibility to natural green space standards, the angst thresholds. They've been around since the late 1980s, when English Nature used to have a research budget and looked into how big an area for wildlife needs to be to support enough wildlife for people to then get a positive reaction from it, and how close to where people live it needs to be. So these standards have been around for like over 30 years, and I think they're more relevant now than ever before. So I'm trying to work out a way how we can try and include those angst standards within the biodiversity delivery on site and off site to try and make sure it's near to where people live wherever possible. So that's a challenge, but that's the direction I'm trying to go in. And from listening to the rest of this conference, it's quite reassuring to know that people are trying to work out ways to tie up biodiversity net gain with wider social and health outcomes. So, I mean, living in Leeds, it's a heavily urbanised area, so we've got lots of communities with very little access to natural green space or any green space. So it seems to me to be the right thing to do, but it is going to be a big challenge, I think, working with the metric and working with how we can take money maybe and deliver it for new green space. Because it's very hard to get new green space off-site.
Yeah.
You know, so on-site I think would be really good if the development area is big enough. And I welcome a long-term situation where when we're accepting new sites through the site allocation plan process, which within the local authority is looking at all your new development for a 5 or 10 year period, it'd be great if we're only accepting new sites that can deliver natural green space, maybe within that red line. So I have to work with green space provision colleagues in another bit of the council, and that can be a challenge because they use different access standards to the Natural England accessible natural green space ones. So yeah, there's lots to think about. So yeah.
That's brilliant. Just a couple of things, and I will come to you, Andy. Are you able to maybe put a link to that Natural England in the chat, perhaps, Richard? And also the other thing is, so the biometric you're talking about is using this one that is currently being developed. So that you're saying that the plans that come to you are already using that metric, are you?
Yes, the version 2.0. Yes, that's only because 6 months ago I wrote some guidance for how we want developers and consultants to use the metric. We want them to use it and how we want them to use it, because it is open to interpretation, isn't it? So we think it's very important to put some kind of extra guidance on there, how we see it being delivered in Leeds, which again hasn't got policy backing, but I thought was very important. And all the consultants that I sent that guidance to found it very useful. At least they know our expectations within the local authority. And that's available on the Leeds City Council website. If you just typed in net gain for biodiversity Leeds City Council, it'll take you to a page with that guidance on it. And you will see within that guidance that I've referred to the Natural England angst thresholds. So I think you should be able to get to everything from there. But I'm kind of aware Natural England archive things on their website over the years. So to get to their original angst thresholds can be a bit more of a challenge. But if you Googled it, I'm sure you would find it, because some other strategic documents have been talking about it as well. Public Health England did one earlier this year about the importance of green space near where people live. And that does refer to the Natural England standards as well. So I was quite pleased to see that in there.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that, Richard. So I'll go Andy and then Rob. Andy, did you have something to say?
No, I'm just going to say to Richard there, isn't one of the key points about the new process is that local authorities will have to have a net gain delivery plan? Isn't that your opportunity to embed your guidance and policy in the Leeds City Council net gain delivery plan? isn't that the way?
Sounds like you might be writing that, Richard.
Well, I think what we need is a policy that kind of helps add value to the Environment Bill information. We'll need policy and we'll need supplementary planning guidance. So the guidance I've written at the moment, we'll have to think about ways of tweaking it, because I know more than I did 6 months ago, but how we turn it into supplementary planning guidance. And that will be a challenge, because one of the key things I'm trying to do is work out how we can take money, a sum, as a local authority, from the developer where they can't deliver it all on site. So we're saying, okay, we'll take on the responsibility for the offsite delivery. So we have to set a figure for that. And it's very difficult to set one particular figure that covers everything. So at the end of the day, it's almost thinking what is reasonable for us to take. And then how we actually spend that money is a challenge as well. How we take it through a 106, how we ring fence it, how we have the resources to find out where to then deliver it, because it's almost a two-stage process. If we haven't got a habitat bank set up at the moment, we're saying, okay, we'll take on the responsibility, take a sum of money from the developer. If you've got no other options, if there's no other habitat bank, if the Environment Bank aren't active in our area, all we can do is try and give you a way forward. So we're willing to take on that responsibility, but it means that the time we sign the 106 agreement, we don't know where we're delivering those biodiversity units. So we need some flexibility as a local authority. It may take us a year, it may take us 2 years to find the right piece of land that also is in the right location to deliver social benefits as well as biodiversity ones. And I'm fairly comfortable with an approach like that. But it does mean we need extra resources to do the liaison with landowners or the other bits of the council land or the wildlife trust or other nature reserves where we can deliver those units. So it is interesting when you read the Environment Bill, what it's saying in there, but also what it's not saying. It's almost like the approach I want to deliver is not quite laid out in the Environment Bill. It's more catering for market forces to set up habitat banks, etc. All right.
Great. And thanks for the link, Phil. And Rob, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, so I lost a bit of internet connection, so I might have missed something, but just a question for Richard. You were mentioning about red line boundaries, and local authority, I do a lot of work in Bristol, and they have a lot of very small infill sites where there's not really a great deal of scope for getting gain. And there's not yet a monetary fund set up. So it sounds like you're probably in the same situation. How are you dealing with those small sites?
Yeah, it's a very good question. At the moment in Leeds, we haven't taken a sum of money yet where you can't deliver it on site, but we've got 3 live schemes. One of them this afternoon, I'm having to go to a plans panel meeting to describe to the members why we want to take this approach. But we've got 3 schemes that are all small ones, maybe 10 units, 4 units, and we're finding we've got 0.8 biodiversity units down, or maybe 2 biodiversity units to get back to neutral or plus 10%. So we're talking about small numbers of units, biodiversity units, but we are offering this approach. Say, if you set a cost, say £20,000 per biodiversity unit, you could maybe agree with the developer that they will pay that sum of money. So based on 1 or 2 biodiversity units, it's a relatively small sum of money compared to saying to them, lose one of your housing units. If instead, we're giving them a way forward, that's an approach that I think is quite sensible. But we haven't actually done it yet. Part of my role within the council is trying to educate the planning officers and give them assurance it is okay to do this. But I'm also mindful the Environment Bill isn't absolutely clear on that. What they talk about is a national biodiversity credit, where if there's no options available locally at all, you can maybe go to Natural England or DEFRA nationally and buy a credit that way. And I don't know where it would be delivered, maybe somewhere within your own district. But what I'm suggesting is almost like a local version of a biodiversity credit. And to me, it makes total sense, because people like me and my colleagues, we kind of know where the social deprivation problems are and all these other issues. And we want to try and guide new green space provision to those areas. And I know the Parks and Countryside team that work in a different bit of the council to me, they've got extreme cutbacks as well. And all they seem to talk about is improving the quality of existing green space, not the quantity. So what I'm talking about is actually saying we need more green space and it needs to be natural. And that's not really on anyone's agenda. So it's how we move into a world where we can use biodiversity net gain to maybe purchase new land, maybe purchase land that community groups can have ownership of, and they're part of that land and how it develops for wildlife. I quite like the ideas of community ownership of land and getting really strong relationships with what's happening on that land over periods of time. But I think overall, the key things that come out to me about this new process are we've got biodiversity being delivered on site and we've got biodiversity being delivered off site. And these are both very important areas. And I don't hear the Environment Bill really talking about the on-site stuff. It talks about the off-site in relation to conservation covenants and other things. But I'm seeing that we're getting probably more desire to deliver net gain on-site as well, because developers think that's a less risky situation. So I'm still in a situation where I'm trying to work out how can we get good delivery of biodiversity on site, because the current system doesn't work, where consultants write really good management plans and we can have a planning condition to say, write this management plan for your bit of on-site biodiversity. But then the payment for the long-term management comes from the new residents. And who appoints the contractor? It might be a general landscape contractor who does the biodiversity management. We have no control of those factors. So I know here in Leeds, we get really good quality management plans for the on-site biodiversity, but then there's a problem with implementation of it. And I'm trying to think, how can we address that? And the only way I think we could do it is saying to the developer, maybe we need to take a sum of money from you for the on-site biodiversity as well. And we want to say in who's doing the biodiversity management as well. There might be ecological consultancies that have an estate management arm. I mean, I know there are near where I live, but we can't specify through planning that you have to appoint that particular contractor. The developers don't like that. So it's a complicated picture, and it's the on-site as well as the off-site. I think we have to keep an eye on what's happening.
Do people generally feel encouraged that there is this sort of 30-year, the land does have, because I'm just comparing it to district level licensing, where the upfront cost is meant to cover those compensatory ponds for 25 years, but actually there's nothing stopping the landowner who has that pond from filling that in the following year. There's nothing regulatory. So at least with biodiversity net gain, it seems that there is something built in that's mandatory. I don't know what people feel about that. That seems like a step in the right direction, at least.
I can say something on that if you want, or
yeah, Andy, go for it.
Andy.
But I was just going to say, it's still an enforcement issue, isn't it? I mean, whatever the developer might propose in their lovely 30-year management plan, what happens if it doesn't quite happen? Work out. The developer still has the obligation to do it, and that it'll be by Section 106 agreement, won't it? I'm not sure, or conservation covenants, I suppose.
Or something similar, yeah.
But it's still a real enforcement burden for a local authority to do the monitoring and has it been achieved? Have we achieved good condition neutral grassland or just average condition? All those, it's a minefield, really. It's got 30 years.
It's a minefield. I just feel that at least it's in there, whereas I think with district level licensing, there's been this deliberate light touch approach because they've been trying to encourage landowners to get involved, and I think people feel if it's very light touch, landowners might be too scared about offering land for ponds, whereas this seems at least there's at least that intention to make it mandatory to keep that area for 30 years.
I think it's probably easier with a newt mitigation than it is with all the complexities of a BNG, proposal of lots of different habitats and lots of different conditions, statuses, and scores.
Yeah. Okay. That's another. So there's another. Alexander, did you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, sure. I apologise for the very fluffy jumper I'm wearing today. It's particularly cold in the house. So I work in sort of a very interesting field in that we work with predominantly charity groups and volunteers who are both planning the canal restoration of a long linear project, both through several counties and councils, but also delivering the construction work. So it's a very long, drawn-out process, which I think takes on average 20 to 30 years for them to actually go from one end to the other on occasion. So the difficulty we have is that most of these groups don't have their own ecologists to support sort of enhancement projects or BNGs against, for example, and they will try and get away with doing as little as possible to reduce the cost because it's all fundraised, etc. So the question I wonder is whether there's scope in the future of BNGs that local authorities or ecological consultancies would offer support either pro bono or to offer grants to actually help these groups, which can easily demonstrate significant gains in terms of for us, the big thing for us is ecological connectivity, which was a bit of a shame to hear that they're sort of cutting out the metric this time round, because that would have been a really, really easy win for us. So it's that sort of thing, whether there is that future partnership work that can be undertaken between different groups to sort of support voluntary ones.
Can I just ask Alexander where the canal is?
Oh, all over the place. So we work on the ones that have been derelict or been filled in. So often during in farmland, arable land, derelict. There's a few triple SIs, which is a whole different issue to deal with down the line, or now really. So for example, we've got some in Lichfield, which I know do ask for biodiversity net gain to be incorporated already. We've got projects on the Montgomery Canal, Essex, Surrey, Wales, literally everywhere where there used to be a canal. So it's about, I think there's like 2,000 miles that we're looking to have restored and sort of connecting back up to the main networks.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'm about 5 minutes from a canal restoration project here, and I know that Stroud in
yes, and that's one we've been working with quite closely. We've got a project on Westfield Lock coming up, sort of the last mile between Stroud Water.
Yeah.
And that roundabout, which is great.
And obviously that project is working quite closely with Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, I think. So I don't know whether they're fulfilling any of the areas that you're talking about.
Yes, it's really interesting. I think the Cotswolds Canal is probably the one with the most significant sort of case study. Actually, this is how you do it properly. They've got the partnerships, they've got the council behind them, they've got all these groups all supporting it. And I will be talking to their project manager, which is, I believe, John Pontefract, in the future to sort of discuss how they've gone about it. But it's the other groups, which are often your retired individuals who use usually one man and a dog potentially with a vision to restore a canal, which sort of takes effect.
So I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that question about whether there would be help to develop biodiversity net gain plans for projects like that.
I would have thought consultancies would be really keen to help with that kind of thing. I can't see why they wouldn't. It sounds good. I don't know about local authorities.
It might come back down to money, maybe. Anybody else wanted to come in on that one specifically? Thanks for that.
Oops, I apologise for the construction in the background. The other hope I want to really get for the canal network is sort of get incorporated into the national nature recovery networks and the national recovery networks. There's again that connectivity between different areas, and actually that's a whole different case I'm going to start moving forward.
Yeah.
So am I just right in thinking, Alexander, that you are offering your canal sites as for other people's offsets? Is that what you want to be putting your hands up to be an offset provider?
Yes, so that'll be one of the many plans, because I mean, ideally we've got plenty of hedgerows and opportunities there. Some sites will own lots of different areas, and just off the canal, but even off the canal itself is a habitat in the biodiversity metric. It gets a bit difficult when you're replacing amenity again.
Well, I think that's the trouble. If you've got to replace like for like, there's a preference for like for like. Not many people go digging up canals, therefore don't need to do a canal restoration.
Yeah.
But, I'd have thought, that someone's going to have to improve the mechanism of offset delivery and become a delivery body, whether it's going to be wildlife trusts or charities like yourselves. But it will be difficult for very small charities to be registered offset providers, I imagine. And it's simply the legal agreements that have to get signed up will make that quite difficult, I'd have thought.
So just a couple of things on that. Warwickshire County Council, which have really led the way a lot in terms of biodiversity net gain. They are currently advertising on their website for landowners to come forward if they are interested in having their land available for offsetting for losses elsewhere. And also another ecologist mentioned that wildlife trusts may well see this as an opportunity to offer their sites for offset, but the government's probably going to be fairly careful about biodiversity net gain monies not going into areas that would have been funded anyway. So I don't know in a way it seems like a good opportunity for wildlife trusts to get areas, and obviously they're well placed because they understand the biodiversity of the areas that they're in, but I don't know whether people have anything to say on that.
I mean, what I would love to see personally is a register of sites that could be on part of the database, so a developer could look through and see the sites looking for opportunities to be invested into that are local to either local or strategic priority areas that could receive their funds or their support, whether it's work or income.
Yeah.
Except the preferences for on-site mitigation, as we've said, the angst guidelines or whatever, green space on-site, close to people. So
and I think the metric will very strongly favour on-site or close to the site, and it will penalise off-site in whatever kind of scoring.
Yeah.
I don't know quite how that's going to work in practice, but yeah.
I think there are going to be enough sites which can't do sufficient delivery on site that you will have to do off-site or pay into a fund. That's, again, a lot of people haven't mentioned the whole concept of the tariff. If one can't offset or deliver on site or even nearby, pay a cash sum into a delivery body. And that is already.
Sorry, what was that? And dropped out then, Andy?
That sort of system is happening already. Like in Oxfordshire, we've got a site where we can't mitigate the loss of 2.75 biodiversity units, and we are going to pay a cash lump sum to TOE, Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment. They used to always deliver the landfill tax credit, so they're an existing delivery body. They're going to get £30,000 of our cash to deliver net gain somewhere else. I'd love to know where it's going to be. That's attractive.
You can
but
go and
it's a very
visit it.
attractive, it's a lovely, attractive, simple option. It's a planning condition. It's not a Section 106 agreement. We pay the cash, we tick the box.
Yeah, well,
Right, it's attractive. In this particular instance, it's very attractive.
Question for Andy there then. How did you agree on what the amount would be for the unit, and does it compare with Richard's figure that he's got in Leeds?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure I should say.
Well, you've told us the overall figure.
We could do the math.
If you record that, you might get an inkling from what I've said if you're recording it. But
Okay.
It's a guinea pig system. We were, various numbers have been touted, haven't they? £10,000 to £15,000 per unit in some of the original consultation a couple of years ago. So yeah, no, I'm not going to say on this one. It's at the bottom end of the scale. And basically it saves me from drawing up a 30-year management plan and having to have that enshrined in a Section 106 agreement. And we needed a quick decision on this particular project. So.
Well, yes, it sounds ideal in many ways. Is there anything anybody wants to say on developers, or should we go on to Richard? Yes, if you'd like to say something you wanted to say.
Yeah, we were on an important point there about sums of money, and yeah, there is no magic sum. Yeah, there's no magic sum. I mean, at the end of the day, the way we see it is, if you can't deliver the units on site, have you as the landowner got any other land available nearby that you could deliver the units on? If you haven't got land available, is there a third-party habitat bank active in your area, like the Environment Bank or this TOW down there? If there is one available, go to them. But if you've got absolutely no other options, what we're saying at the moment as a local authority is, we will allow you to pay, sounds very generous, doesn't it? We'll allow you to pay us a sum of money. But what we're doing as a local authority is taking on the responsibility of delivering those units. And that's a very big responsibility. So my concern is we don't set that sum of money too low. If anything, it has to be high enough to be seen as a deterrent and a very last ditch scenario. And my guess is over the next couple of years, market forces will set up. Things like the Environment Bank will become more active in West Yorkshire, where I live, and they will probably set their unit cost lower than what our local authority one is. But what I'm having to consider is we might need to buy new land in order to deliver those biodiversity units. And the Environment Bill is silent on using money to buy land, because just the action of buying land doesn't mean you're increasing the units. It's almost a two-stage thing. You've got to buy land and then deliver the units. So you need enough money that you can do that in case you need to buy land. So, I mean, I'm quite open. In the guidance on the website, you'll see that what I'm stating is £20,000 per unit, and there are sums of money on top of that, because we're going to have to employ someone to facilitate and work with the landowners where it's going to happen, monitoring for that 30-year period and reporting back to government under the Environment Bill. What we're also suggesting is a 5% figure outside of delivering units, but for strategic projects in our area. That's almost like a grant source pot of money, and I think that's what they were doing in Warwickshire as well. There was an extra pot of money that you can then use as a kind of local grant scheme. But I'm also totally aware the Environment Bill doesn't say the approach I'm suggesting is the one to do, but to me, I'm trying to work out how we can deliver biodiversity in Leeds and using the local authorities' resources, and the monitoring has to be covered as a cost as well as part of that. So it's a big challenge. I may find that over the next couple of years, the approach I want to do is challenged somehow. But at the moment, we're saying it's not compulsory. This is just a voluntary option. If you as the developer wants to just throw in a sum of money, we're willing to take on that responsibility. And my job then is to make sure that money isn't lost, but it's actually invested in the right places. And I'm just one part-time ecologist in the planning function. And I know I'm going to need more resources if we're going to implement a system like this.
Yeah,
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, whether there should be a mitigation hierarchy of not just leaping for paying the cash option. So again, there's a lot that's being negotiated on the hoof, really, and we are inventing it as we go along. Again, the TOW thing have asked for 20% overhead for their admin costs of implementing this scheme, as well as the actual amount per unit. And as you're right, the market will develop for offset receptor land. And again, we, as our company, we're not selling on redundant land in case we need it for our own offsetting. So it is actually changing the way we do things.
So just one final point on that. There are, I have read somewhere that developers might develop some offset land for themselves and actually sell that on if it's more than they need. I don't know whether that's actually likely to happen, but it's a potential, I suppose.
It's happening in Surrey with Sangs land. Yeah.
So if there is an example. Richard, did you have your hand up, or was that from before?
It was from before, but I will just say one last point. I don't want to talk for too long, but what I'm seeing in Leeds is we've got land agents, like planning land agents, who are actually on their website advertising themselves as a kind of habitat bank. They're contacting landowners to see if they've got land available for net gain delivery, which is interesting. So that's like a commercial, agricultural land agent getting into this as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see where that goes. But yeah, I couldn't mute myself then, so you might want to mute me.
No problem. I mean, if anybody gets the ENDS report, last month, one of the headlines was net gain gold mine, and the subheading was, if we're going to build, the government's target is 300,000 houses a year. If we're going to build that, where's all the offsetting going to happen for that? Will people be selling their land or whatever? But anyway, I think we'll just half an eye on the time. We'll just maybe have a quick chat about what this might mean for ecologists, although some of these points we would have covered already. I'm just going to share my screen again. And I have just put a few of the links that I found quite useful in the chat, and if anybody and other people have added links as well. And obviously you can save the chat at the end if you want to have access to any of those links. So again, what could it mean for ecologists? Well, we've obviously talked about hopefully developers will get ecologists appointed early on and involved early on, but as Andy said, it's not necessarily ecologists, it could be other. Another friend of mine was saying that he felt that biodiversity net gain really favours the large sites and the larger consultancies who are perhaps more able to incorporate GIS. They might even have somebody whose sole job it is to work on GIS. I'm sure, places like Jacobs that Gregory is working for probably have that whole departments on that. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely.
And we'll do it. But it's interesting to see that it is going to be very much for minor sites as well as major sites. Would it generate more work for ecologists than sort of species-specific mitigation or plans and projects? And I think we've even touched on the fact that it probably will be quite a bit more complicated than species-specific plans. Gosh, that's hard to say. And that was kind of touched on this morning as well, with somebody talking about the upskilling that needs to happen. And ecologists, like everybody else, tend to train for the areas that they are likely to work in. And if this is not exactly a new area, but an expanding area, will there need to be a lot more training? I'll just stop screen sharing those for a while for now, just so that I can see you. But if anybody else maybe wants to come in on that, and what it means for ecologists. Right. If there's nothing on that one, then we might move on to our area, which is contractors. I have no idea really whether businesses like ours will get more money out of this scheme, but it would be really interesting. I mean, a lot of the work that we currently do, we were talking about great crested newt mitigation, which we get involved in a lot and have done traditionally. That may well change a lot. We're very unlikely to get involved in any of the district level licensing mitigation. So it would be interesting if people have any examples of how biodiversity net gain has been delivered in their areas. I mean, Andy's talking about paying another organisation and that sort of happening kind of separately, but whether people have any examples of how that happens and what's physically involved in creating that offset land, really, whether it's on site or off site. I don't know whether anybody wants to come in on that.
Well, so Liz, I haven't got any experience of any biodiversity net gain actually being implemented yet on any projects, but I think Richard was saying that earlier, that it probably will need more specialist contractors than having, Joe Bloggs who knows how to do a bit of paving. So perhaps there is an opportunity there. You know, if we're looking at 30 years and trying to improve meadow diversity, then you know, it's not something that every landscape contractor is going to know how to do.
No. Well, just on, somebody was talking before about the ongoing monitoring, and we've had a little involvement in SUDS maintenance, and what we found is that you know, they get put into housing developments and completely left, and then a few years later somebody comes along and says it's all clogged up, and actually it's doing the opposite of what it's meant to be doing, and it's flooding around that area, and can you come along and do some maintenance, which is really interesting, because SUDS is obviously the developers have to put that in as flood mitigation, but they don't seem to have to put in any system to maintain it. So it'd be interesting to know whether biodiversity net gain is going to be the same, whether there will be systems in place to actually maintain that the landscape in the way that it needs to be maintained. But just,
yeah, I mean, you need landscape contractors that read reports for a start, don't you? Not all of them do.
No, for sure. But the sort of plans that you're doing, Rob, what at the moment you're talking about biodiversity net gain plans that you're doing, what kind of offset land would you be recommending?
I haven't got to that stage. So I'm working on 2 at the moment. Probably they will need to look at offsite, but I haven't even begun to see what's available. And the other ones I've done have all been on-site.
And actually, I slightly take issue with something that Julia from Balfour Beatty said earlier, that this can't just be regulatory, you know, businesses are going to have to take it on. I think actually it has to be regulatory. I don't think that developers are going to take on biodiversity net gain fully unless it's mandatory. Obviously it will eventually be mandatory, but also some of the developers like Barrett's and Redrow have had their biodiversity net gain documents, you know, which has obviously been voluntary to date. And I have read a biodiversity net gain plan from a developer, not one of those, but before, and it literally consisted of encouraging residents to have bird boxes in their garden. So not only was it very minimal, it was also passing almost a responsibility onto the residents of the homes that they were building, rather than the responsibility for onto the developer. So
and in any case, bird boxes don't count towards any gain.
Well, and nor should they, really. Yeah. So there are probably going to be some exceptions to the biodiversity net gain, as far as I understand it, but smaller sites will be included, which I think is probably encouraging. You know, there's no reason why they shouldn't be included. And I would just, I have put a number of those links into the group chat, but I would also say if you go onto CIEEM site, they've got loads of case studies which are quite short for biodiversity net gain, and those are really worth having a look at as well. But unless anybody else, probably wrap it up unless anybody else has got anything else to say. Thanks very much for coming along and for all your contributions. That's been brilliant, been really useful.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks
very much. Thank you.
Nice to meet you all.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice to see you. Cheerio, folks.